So I've entitled this section of material, the Roaring Twenties, to differentiate it from the Progressive Era in the 19 teens and earlier. If during the Progressive Era, progressive Americans encouraged their fellow Americans to restrain themselves for the betterment of the country, the 1920s tend to be more defined by excess, of flouting the kind of rules that progressive Americans wanted to impose on everybody, including the 18th Amendment. The 18th Amendment establishes prohibition. It makes illegal the distribution and sale of spirituous liquors, as it's put into the Constitution. What exactly that meant is going to become clearer in the enforcement law that's passed to make the 18th Amendment enactable. The Volstead Act. The Volstead Act makes it clear that this includes not just hard alcohol, which some Americans thought the 18th Amendment might only include hard alcohol, but to include most forms of alcohol, not just whiskey, bourbon, and other forms of hard alcohol, but also beer as well as wine for everything but religious purposes. And this is a progressive era accomplishment. The Prohibition Amendment was something that progressive Americans had been pushing for a long time in the United States. For many progressives, alcohol was the fly in the ointment. It was the thing that led to all sorts of negative outcomes in the United States. So the passage of this amendment in 1920 is seen as a real success story. But on the other hand, in the 1920s, more and more Americans are going to behave as though the 18th Amendment is not even there. To consume alcohol, even though it's illegal. There were lots of ways to get around the law. For example, if you could consume alcohol if it was for religious purposes. The Catholic Church had an exemption, and pretending to be a Catholic priest is a little hard. But there was an exemption also for Jewish Americans. And so for whatever reason, in the 1920s, there were a lot of more rabbis than there used to be who were claiming exemptions to the 18th Amendment so that they could consume alcohol for religious reasons. Wealthy Americans, and this seems fairly emblematic of the 1920s as well, wealthy Americans could get around the 18th Amendment if they were members of elite clubs. The Manhattan Club in New York, for example, when the 18th Amendment was clearly going to be passed, the Manhattan Club bought up lots and lots of alcohol. Basically, they had a stockpile of alcohol that would last them to the 18th Amendment's repeal in the 1930s. And they could avoid the law because they weren't selling alcohol. They weren't transporting it across state lines. They were providing alcohol free of charge to anybody who could pay for the membership fee for the Manhattan Club. So lots of people could avoid the 18th Amendment, could consume alcohol anyway, sometimes in illegal ways, sometimes in fishy but legal ways. And for many Americans, consuming alcohol was something that was technically bad because the law said it was bad, but might have not been seen as all that bad. So for many Americans, yes, it might be illegal to consume alcohol, but is it really morally wrong? I often explain this to students in a similar way to marijuana today. Marijuana is legal in some states, illegal in other states, and this seems to have done something to change the public perception of marijuana. Similarly, with the 18th Amendment in the 1920s, alcohol consumption is illegal. You could be arrested for selling or distributing alcohol, but everyone did it anyway, or lots of people did anyway. I shouldn't say everybody. Lots of people did it anyway. And this seems rather emblematic of the period because lots of different values that had been firmly entrenched in the Victorian psyche through to the end of the 19th century were open for question in the 1920s. Many Americans not only flouted the rules regarding alcohol consumption, but a number of other values and traditions were open for questioning as well. Another outcome of the Progressive Era, at the end of the Progressive Era, is the passage of the 19th Amendment, which recognized the right of women to vote. And in many respects, women's lives were changing in the 1920s, perhaps in fashion more than in other respects. The image of the flapper becomes a stock image of the 1920s. Flappers wore less constrictive clothing. Victorian women were expected to wear all sorts of devices and amendments to their clothing to emphasize their femininity. Whereas the flappers delighted in shunning those kind of adornments and wearing simple clothing that allowed them to more effectively enjoy the social landscape. You can see on the images in front of you, women who were identified as flappers also cut their hair short, and in some respects adopted more masculine styles of dressing and acting. And so in some respects, some people look at the 1920s and see a moment of time in which Americans are, in some respects, liberated from the customs and expectations of the past. And for many of them, this could be found in the abundant consumer marketplace of the 1920s. And looking at the advertisement for hair curlers in front of you, you can understand why some people would look at this consumer culture of the 1920s and see some aspects to it that were quite liberating. The advertisement for hair curlers on the slide in front of you shows one woman who, with the benefit of these hair curlers that she could buy, could change her hairstyle into 5 different ways. So she was not bound by the traditions of the past. She was not bound by the way her parents raised her. She could simply go out in the marketplace, buy hair curlers, and transform who she was. In other respects, however, women certainly had a ceiling on challenging the barriers of the past. More women were in the workforce than ever before in the 1920s, but proportionally, not necessarily so. So the absolute number of women who were working outside of the home for wages had gone up in the 1920s, but whether this was a significant increase in terms of the overall scale of the U.S. population is a matter of debate. Certainly the jobs that women tended to be confined to in the 1920s reflected earlier standards of what many Americans regarded as female work. So women disproportionately filled positions as nurses, as teachers, as secretaries in offices. When it came to advancement, there often was an expectation women would not seek advancement for more managerial kind of positions. So perhaps in some respects, women's lives were changing and earlier expectations were being cast off. But in other respects, women's lives were still constrained by the expectations of gender that continued to be enforced in the 1920s. The automobile in the 1920s and beyond became a symbol of the kind of freedom Americans could find in this consumer marketplace. In the 19-teens, Henry Ford revolutionized the auto industry. He basically took the principles of the meatpacking industry, put an automobile chassis on a kind of conveyor belt that went around the shop floor. It was extended from the ceiling, so it was a chain on a chained chassis to the ceiling, and it would zigzag around the shop floor, and at each step of the process, a different set of workers would do a very specific task on this chassis. Maybe one group of workers would attach the fenders, another group of workers would attach the headlights, and breaking up the construction of the automobile into these minute parts allowed Ford to dramatically increase the speed of production. By the 1920s, many Americans could afford to buy automobiles, either new or used. There was a new market in used automobiles that were for sale across the United States as well. And with the automobile, this really opened up the possibility for Americans to feel free in a real literal way, to go where they wanted to go, or for young people to court each other beyond the watchful eyes of their parents in the privacy of an automobile. So automobiles provided that kind of freedom and independence that some found in this consumer marketplace of the 1920s. The automobile also represented the expanding opportunities for credit in the 1920s. The kind of credit that you get today, if you go out to a dealership and try to buy an automobile, you can trace that back all the way to the 1920s. When Ford and other companies extended lines of credit to their dealers so that they could buy more cars, so that they could sell more cars. A lot of dealers simply extended that line of credit they received from the manufacturer onto the consumer, and voila, consumer credit so that more and more Americans could buy automobiles had been created. Ford also is quite innovated by the beginning of the 1920s anyway, as a part of this broader movement that sometimes is called welfare capitalism. So Ford was really an interesting character. Later in life, he becomes quite bitter, had this kind of megalomania complex. He tries to start this utopian community down in Brazil that was going to be producing rubber for his cars, and it went into a disastrous decline. But earlier in his career, Ford was quite innovative in offering what many of his competitors regarded as the ridiculous sum of $5 a day for workers. And what they meant by ridiculous is that it was ridiculously high. Ford's competitors thought there's no way he's going to be able to make a car and remain profitable if he's paying his workers $5 a day. What Ford realized was that at $5 a day, he would be able to keep his workers because they would be happy. They wouldn't go off to other companies. And yes, you could teach someone in a fairly short period of time to do that small step that you needed them to do. But if you kept someone for years, they would get really, really fast at that very simple step. And saving a few seconds at each step along the way allowed Ford to produce vehicles at an incredible pace. By 1927, as the slide in front of you is indicating, Ford's production facility was producing an automobile every 24 seconds. And so by offering this incredibly generous wage, Ford was able to not only increase profits for himself, but be a part of this broader movement that suggested that Americans could rely upon their employers to provide them with the good life for things like health care coverage and pension plans so that they could retire. This broader movement of welfare capitalism suggested that workers didn't need the government to provide these kinds of things. Other nations in Europe by this point were doing things like in Germany, providing workers with health care coverage. But the sense in the United States is the government didn't need to do those kinds of things because workers could rely upon their employers to provide those services because employers wanted to keep their workers. Employers wanted their workers to be happy so that they wouldn't go off to one of their competitors. And because of that, employers could safely rely upon their employers to provide them the kind of benefits that in other countries in the Atlantic world, workers expected their governments to provide them. And for many Americans in the 1920s, they really were economically good times. In a little bit, we'll look at some of the holes in the 1920s economy. But one reason it's referred to as the Roaring Twenties is because of the roaring cultural changes that were taking place in the 1920s. But part of it is because of the roaring economy that for many in industrial America, industrial production really was providing the kind of good life that Americans could enjoy. The national parks provide an example of why some Americans found the automobile to be a freeing sort of item within the consumer marketplace. Prior to the automobile, a lot of national parks were in relatively hard to access areas of the country. If you think of places like Yellowstone, for example, there still aren't very many people who live there. It's in a pretty remote area. And if you were alive in 1900, how would you get there? Well, you'd have to get on a train and buy a train ticket, pay for your food in restaurants, and pay for a hotel once you got there. All of this together meant that most of the national parks in the United States, prior to the 1920s, most of those national parks were the reserve of the very well-to-do, people who could afford not only to take the time off from work, but could afford the train fare, the hotel fees. If you go to a lot of these national parks today, a lot of them will still have these rather elite-looking hotels on their campuses that were built in this area prior to the 1920s when the national parks were relatively inaccessible. But the automobile means that it's possible for an American to get in their car. You don't have the interstate system, so automobile transit was still relatively slow because you're using state highways, state roads, no interstates. But you could get in your car, pack a few baskets with sandwiches, bring some equipment with you, and voila, you don't have to pay for a hotel, you don't have to pay for restaurants. It's a relatively cheap and easy way to roam around the country and see all of these sites. And for many Americans, that was a very freeing sort of experience. But for other Americans, they find the kind of urban, consumerist culture of urban America to be rather superficial. The kind of freedom that Americans enjoyed in this consumer marketplace, at least for some people, was not a real, genuine freedom that was worthy of celebration. One of those individuals who was concerned about the kind of superficiality that was being encouraged in the 1920s is F. Scott Fitzgerald. A lot of you guys probably read The Great Gatsby when you were in high school. If you read between the lines of The Great Gatsby, you'll see that it is basically a critique of the consumerist culture of the 1920s. Because what do you have in the book but the two main characters, or rather the two villains of the book, Tom and Daisy. Tom is a rather dull, not brutish kind of person. Daisy is not very intelligent herself. Both of them, however, have a lot of respect because they have a lot of stuff. At one point in the book, Daisy takes Jay Gatsby on a tour of her closet to show off all the fun stuff that she has. Tom was a veteran of the First World War, but apparently bought his medals from some rather obscure small countries in Europe to prove his self-worth. So both of these people don't seem to have a whole lot of substance. They're not of high moral character. They're not all that intelligent, but they're valued by everyone else around them because they have a lot of stuff and they live in a big house. And over the course of the book, the main character, Jay Gatsby, who's in some respects the hero of the book, he's desperately in love with Daisy. And at one point in the book, he and Daisy are driving together in a car. Daisy secretly knows that her husband Tom is having an affair with the wife of an auto mechanic. And it just so happens that with Daisy behind the wheel, Jay Gatsby and Daisy drive past the auto shop where her husband's mistress lives. She runs out thinking that her lover, Tom, is coming for a visit. Really, it's Daisy and Jay, though. Daisy runs her over, kills her. There's a rather descriptive scene of her dead body in the book. And because he loves her so much, Jay Gatsby takes the blame and says that he was the one behind the wheel of the car. The woman's husband, the auto mechanic, is distraught and angry that Jay Gatsby has killed his wife. So he finds out where Jay Gatsby lives. He goes to his house and shoots him, and he dies in a pool of water, in his swimming pool. And at the end of the book, Tom and Daisy get off scot-free. No consequences, no troubles in their lives. And as Nick, the narrator, who's kind of in this world, he's a reporter, but he's really kind of the omniscient narrator of the story. He reflects upon the way in which these rather wealthy people have smashed up everybody else's lives except themselves, and are totally oblivious by the end of the story that they have had such dire consequences for everybody else, and they're going to keep living in their content stupor for the rest of their lives. So for some people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, rather than looking at the consumer marketplace of the 1920s and seeing opportunities for freedom and liberation, they look at this consumer marketplace and they see corruption, they see greed, they see superficiality. For many rural Americans as well, the 1920s are not the Roaring Twenties. One of the big holes in the economy of the Roaring Twenties is in rural America. There was a brief dip in the economy after World War I. Between 1919 and 1921, many people believed the nation was on the brink of chaos, massive labor unrest. But then in 1921, the American urban economy recovered quite well. Industrial America was doing just fine. Industrial employment was high, but rural America never recovered from the post-World War I dip in commodity prices. So the Cotton Belt, wheat-growing regions of the country, in the 1920s, those sections of the economy are still struggling. And for many rural Americans, this was seen as a part of a broader anti-rural movement by the 1920s. You can see on the chart in front of you here that for many years leading up to 1920, non-rural America, urban America, had been growing much more quickly than rural America. But you'll notice as well that farm laborers were still expanding in total numbers until 1920. And then in 1920, you'll notice that the overall number of farm laborers begins to actually drop off. It's not just not keeping pace with the exponential growth of urban America anymore, it's actually declining. in its opportunities. And for many rural Americans, looking at their lives, looking at their farms, looking at the opportunities for the future, saw many of their sons and daughters leaving rural America forever and moving off to the cities for work. Another example rural Americans could point to see their world as a world in decline and that they were under assault by urban America is this statistic that comes out in 1920 from the Census Bureau. In 1920, the Census Bureau declares that for the first time, the United States is an urban nation, that more people lived in cities or towns of 2,500 or more for the first time in American history. Now, 2,500 folks is not big. I mean, that's a pretty small town. The point is not that 2,500 is a large city or anything, but it's a sort of psychological moment. It's a moment in time when Americans believed that rural America was under attack, their way of life was in decline, and urban America seemed to be doing just fine. Another example of why many rural Americans felt as though their world was under assault was the expansion of Hollywood films. The motion picture industry was continuing to grow in the 1920s. More and more theaters were opening up, and for many Americans, this was seen as a point of concern. There weren't any federal regulators determining which movies were appropriate for audiences and which weren't. Even to this day, the rating system that we have in this country for movies is industry-driven. It's not government-driven. Industry itself gives those ratings PG, PG-13, R. Those are all decided upon by this private organization, the Motion Picture Association. And for many rural Americans, they looked at the situation and what they saw was this city on the Pacific Coast, Hollywood, that was able rather cheaply to export their values across the rest of the country. All you needed was a film reel, a projector, and a dark room to show the values of Hollywood to the rest of the country. And a lot of these movies were, they're silent movies, first of all, so they had often an organist who played music that would accompany the movies. But a lot of these movies were contrary to the values that many rural Americans considered to be part of their world. And you're going to see a clip from one of those movies, the movie It, in which Clara Bow is the star. It's kind of a reverse Cinderella story, and you'll notice that in many respects, Clara Bow, in her character anyway, rejects the Victorian values that would have expected a woman to know her place. Clara Bow's character is very forceful. She is not going to take things lying down. She's going to create the world that she wants. So for many ways, when you look at this clip, think about how the values expressed in this movie might have conflicted with the values of other Americans. And for many in rural America, movies like It were just one amongst many examples that showed that the way of life of rural America was under assault by urban America. One organization that developed out of this outrage regarding the movie industry was an organization called the Legion of Decency. It was a Catholic organization designed to help Catholic moviegoers navigate the movie industry. So they knew which movies were appropriate, which movies were inappropriate. For many years, a stamp of approval or disapproval from the Legion of Decency would mean better or worse ticket sales. By the 1960s, the Legion of Decency eventually fades away. Part of the problem by the 1960s is that a stamp of disapproval from the Legion of Decency, for moviegoers in the 1960s, a stamp of disapproval from this organization meant that was the movie you should go see. That if the Legion of Decency didn't like it, then it must have had something pretty crazy in there, and you better go see it. So by the 1960s, more and more folks within the Legion of Decency had the sense that they weren't really accomplishing their mission anymore. Rather than telling people which movies not to watch, their messages were now telling moviegoers which movies to go watch. The 1920s also experienced a flowering of black culture that becomes known as the Harlem Renaissance. Part of the reason this happens is because of the expansion of the urban black population that had occurred during the First Great Migration, during the First World War. And in the 1920s, many white audiences consumed lots of different kinds of black culture, whether it was black visual arts or black music or black literature. white patrons were interested in purchasing and enjoying this music. And I think it's important to look at the limits of what this Harlem Renaissance might represent. That certainly a lot of white audiences are buying and listening to black music, but that does not necessarily suggest a sense of equality amongst those white consumers. I put that quote about Duke Ellington, a famous black musician during the 1920s, to emphasize that for this white journalist reflecting and reviewing Duke Ellington's music, this reviewer was interested in this music, but not because he saw Duke Ellington as like himself, but because he saw him as not like himself, that he tended to regard Ellington's music as exotic, as he puts it in here, he calls it jungle music, which is incredibly offensive, but emphasizes why he was interested in it. Interested in it not because he saw Duke Ellington as his equal, as someone like himself, but because he saw Duke Ellington as someone who was different and unlike himself. So certainly black musicians, black artists have a much higher level of visibility during the 1920s, but that does not necessarily mean that there was an acceptance of equality amongst white consumers buying and listening to black music and consuming black art. Langston Hughes, a graduate of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, he had a white patron who helped fund some of his writing. He was a poet. And at one point in his career, this white patron wrote to him and explained that she felt he was not being African enough in his writing. And Langston Hughes, being a rather diplomatic individual, put things rather delicately and said that as an artist, he was going to make the kind of poetry that he felt was best and wasn't going to try to make something to cater to her rather unique needs, to hear something more African. And many of these black artists, including Langston Hughes, wrote about the problems that black Americans faced, including on the poem in front of you here, the problem of assumed black criminality that Langston Hughes is highlighting in this poem. What you see here is a story about a black renter and a white landlord. The landlord's not doing anything to maintain this facility. They get into an argument. He won't pay the rent. The landlord won't fix the place. The landlord calls the police. They arrest the black tenant. And the whole complicated story gets boiled down into a newspaper clipping that suggests black violence, black irrationality, and ignores the backstory. So it's a rather poetic way that Langston Hughes is trying to highlight the frustration of many black Americans in this period about the inequality that they suffered. Marcus Garvey was certainly one of the more unique advocates for black equality in the 1920s. In many respects, he disagreed quite strongly with other proponents in the black freedom struggle, particularly people like W.E.B. Du Bois. One reason they didn't get along very well is that Marcus Garvey was promoting this idea of black nationalism. And he had a lot of supporters. Lots of black Americans bought into his message and became supporters of Marcus Garvey. And I think in his support, you can see the frustration of many black Americans who believed that black Americans could not find a political home in either of the two major political parties and decided to support something radically different. I've got a short clip here of a speech that Marcus Garvey gave describing the kind of black nationalist movement that he wanted to lead.
When I am dead, wrap the mantle of the red, the black and the green around me, for in the new life I shall rise up with God's grace and blessing to lead the millions of the heights and the triumph that you well know. Look for me in a world when a storm. Look for me all around you. For with God's grace, I shall come back with countless millions of black men and women who have died in America, those who have died in the West Indies, and those who have died in Africa, to aid you in the fight for liberty, freedom, and life.
So I'll pause it there and point out that Marcus Garvey is talking about the connections between black people in America, black people in Africa, and black people in the Caribbean. Garvey himself was born in Jamaica, was an immigrant to the United States, and believed that the plight of people of color around the Atlantic world, not just in the United States, that all of these problems were connected together. And thus, Americans should seek common cause with people in Africa, with people in the Caribbean, to try and solve the set of problems that afflicted all three groups of these people.
Any leadership that teaches you to depend upon another race is a leadership that will enslave you. Any leadership that teaches you to depend upon another race is a leadership that will enslave you. They gave leadership to our foreparents, and that leadership made them slaves. But we have decided to find a leadership of our own to make ourselves free men. Our great scholars have passed through the colleges, the universities, have thrown away the blessed record. Babylon did it. Assyria did it. France under Napoleon did it. Germany under Prince von Bismarck did it. England under America under George Washington did it. Africa with 400 million black people can do it. If you cannot do it, if you are not prepared to do it, then you will die. You race of cowards. You race of imbeciles.
So there, Marcus Garvey is suggesting, one, as I said before, that people of color in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Africa, they have a set of common problems, and they ought to see common cause with one another. And what he was suggesting in the second part of that clip is that people of color needed to create their own leadership. As he said, oppression will only come with white leaders. The black community of the Atlantic world needed black leaders if it was going to be independent. Marcus Garvey's movement that becomes known as UNIA, it's actually still in existence today. It doesn't have nearly the membership that it did back in the 20s or the popularity, but it still exists today. UNIA was trying to set up this alternative government for the black community of the Atlantic world. And one way he hoped to do this was by creating economic connections between these disparate black communities across the Atlantic world. Marcus Garvey's UNIA founds this company called the Black Star Line. And the idea behind it is that before the Black Star Line, white middlemen made the profits off of black resources in Africa. Black labor in the Americas turned those natural resources into purchasable products. And all along the way, black people did the work, black people mined the materials, black people did the manufacturing, and white people skimmed off the top and made profits for themselves. And for Marcus Garvey, it's about time that black people made profits off of their own labor, that black people should be the middlemen. The Black Star Line collapses in part because of government intervention. Marcus Garvey is eventually convicted of mail fraud. He had been selling stock for his Black Star Line, and the government argued that the stock had pictures of ships on it, which they argued was false advertisement because the Black Star Line had not yet purchased its first boat. So on that basis and others, the company was sued. Eventually Marcus Garvey spent some time in prison. But for many black Americans, Marcus Garvey expresses the frustrations that they felt about the world that they lived in the 1920s, and perhaps expressed the sense that the only way black Americans could achieve equality was by creating their own separate government and not supporting white leadership any longer. For the 1920s, the Republican Party is going to dominate the politics of the national government in the 1920s. Warren G. Harding, after the end of the Woodrow Wilson administration, is elected to the presidency in 1920. He's not in office very long. Harding gained his political experience in Ohio. He was part of a political machine there. Once he's elected to the presidency, Harding brings a lot of his friends from Ohio, puts them in his cabinet, and surprise, surprise, a lot of them were really corrupt. And they used their offices for their own personal gain. A lot of them were being tried and convicted. Harding appeared to have been quite miserable and apparently had a heart attack and died while in office. After Harding died, he didn't really have a whole lot of influence over the period of the 1920s, other than to have this incredibly corrupt administration. Harding himself may not have been corrupt, but At the very least, he seems to have appointed a lot of corrupt individuals who were friends of his from the old Ohio political machine from which he came. Calvin Coolidge is going to be the person who dominates the kind of... Calvin Coolidge became president when Harding died in 1923. Calvin Coolidge would stay in the office until 1929 when he's replaced by the Republican successor, Herbert Hoover. And Coolidge's policies are really going to define the nature of the relationship between the federal government and the economy in the 1920s. Ever since Warren Harding had been elected, there was a sense, as Harding put it, that the nation needed to return to normalcy. It was a quote that was often attributed to Harding. It was published in a lot of newspapers. A lot of newspapermen published it to emphasize the kind of limited intellectual capacity of Harding. Normalcy is a word that is of questionable origin. It seems like something he just made up. So it was published over and over again to emphasize Harding's limited grasp of rhetoric. But it emphasized this general trend in Republican policies in the 1920s that the progressive era went too far. That now that the war was over, now that the nation had returned to peace, it ought to return to something different than had been required during the First World War. And Calvin Coolidge is going to give that some real policy teeth. In the video I'm going to show you here, Coolidge is going to be describing what he thinks the country should do to return to a pre-progressive period.
The country needs every ounce of its energy to restore itself. The costs of government are all assessed upon the people. This means that the farmer is doomed to provide a certain amount of money out of the sale of his produce, no matter how low the price to pay his taxes. The manufacturer, the professional man, the clerk must do the same from their income. The wage earner, often at a higher rate when compared with his earnings, makes his contribution, perhaps not directly, but indirectly, in the advance cost of everything he buys. The expenses of the government reach everybody. Taxes take from everyone a part of his earnings, and force everyone to work for a certain part of his time for the government.
So if we could summarize exactly what Calvin Coolidge is complaining about there, he thinks taxes are the problem. You know, that too many Americans were working too long for the government, and thus the government needed to get smaller, it needed to do less, so that Americans could pay fewer taxes. Unsurprisingly, one of the things that Calvin Coolidge does as president is encourages the reduction in taxes. And that's exactly what the Revenue Act of 1926 is designed to do, to reduce the amount of income taxes that Americans paid. At the same time, Coolidge was generally of the impression that the government was doing too much and should scale back on the way that it intervened in the economy. One example of Coolidge taking a direct action to adopt a more laissez-faire approach to government regulation in the economy is his veto of the McNary-Hofkin bill. This was a bill designed to subsidize farmers. You know, as I mentioned before, the rural economy never recovered. A lot of commodity growers were just not doing very well. And so as their representatives, some members of Congress put forward a bill to try to help farmers out, to pay them, to subsidize their income but when they were growing things like corn or soybeans or cotton. But Coolidge vetoed it twice because he's generally of the sense that the economy shouldn't be interfered with by the U.S. government, that if farmers can't be successful on their own, then the government shouldn't be stepping in there and subsidizing their mediocrity. In other ways, Coolidge's program of reform was more subtle. He didn't remove a lot of progressive era programs like the Federal Trade Commission, for example, but he does tend to appoint people to offices in those federal bureaucracies who adopt a position of purposeful inaction. And what I mean by that is they didn't like those programs. They thought the government was doing too much, that it was wasting taxpayer dollars, that it's unnecessarily interfering in the economy. And so they purposefully did little in those agencies. At one point during the 1920s, in 1925, a newspaper headline reported that the president was tired of loafing and was looking for something to do, that there weren't a whole lot of big headlines for much of the 1920s. And part of the reason is the government was intentionally not doing anything. That was the way Coolidge intended it. On the slide in front of you, too, is a picture of Coolidge going fishing with all of his friends. It's a rather iconic picture of Calvin Coolidge. He was known as a rather stiff and formal character who wears a suit and tie to go fishing. Only Calvin Coolidge. He obviously doesn't have a lot of friends. So, Coolidge was not known as a warm and friendly individual. So the Republican Party tended to dominate politics nationally during the 1920s, and for their part, the Democratic Party is in a moment of transition in the 1920s. For decades at this point, there had been two somewhat contradictory forces trying to dominate the Democratic Party, and in the 1920s, these two different forces are becoming less reconcilable. On the one hand, in the Democratic Party, you had the urban industrial North dominated by labor interests in the North, and on the other hand, you had the southern wing of the party. And for many years, these two groups could get along just fine, but in the 1920s, their differences became less and less reconcilable. And that reared its ugly head onto the national stage in the campaigns for the presidential nomination in 24 and 28. In 24, the southern wing of the party won out with the nomination of William McAdoo for president. But in 1928, Al Smith won the Democratic nomination, represented sort of new trends within the Democratic Party. He was the first major party candidate to be a Catholic running for president. He had been born in New York, was contented to stay in New York for the rest of his life, would be fine not going into any sort of agricultural sector ever, was a prominent wet in 1928. That was one issue that was dividing the Democratic Party. The southern wing of the party tended to be known as dries, which meant that they were in favor of prohibition. The northern urban wing of the party tended to be wet and tended to be opposed to prohibition. Being from New York, Al Smith was a part of the wet movement trying to undo prohibition, and New York had done a number of things by 1928 to basically make alcoholic consumption all but legal within the state. And in part because of this internal division, the Democratic Party was not able to launch a major campaign for president that was competitive against the Republicans. But it's a sign of the tensions that will eventually tear the Democratic Party apart, but will be leading the Democratic Party in the 1930s into new directions that will prove very important. Even before 1929, when the stock market actually crashed, there were warning signs on the horizon for thoughtful observers to indicate that something bad was about to happen. On the one hand, you had this problem of overproduction and underconsumption. The problem was that there were simply not enough people who were able to buy the things that American industry was producing. One reason for this underconsumption was the drag on the economy created by the depressed farm sector of the economy. Rural prices were low. This meant that farm income was low, and it thus meant that farmers had little spare income to use to buy new pieces of farm equipment or new appliances for their homes. So the rural sector of the economy continued to be a drag on the economy. The other contributing factor to this underconsumption, overproduction was this growing maldistribution of wealth between 1918 and 1929. What essentially this means is that an increasingly small percentage of the American population controlled an ever-growing percentage of the nation's wealth. And the reason that this was a problem for consumption is that when a smaller percentage of the population controls a larger percentage of the wealth, they don't necessarily increase their consumption correspondingly. You can imagine, for example, an automobile. Well, if you're really wealthy, you could afford to buy 10, but you're still only going to need one, maybe two at most. because you're a single person. You don't need to have 10 cars. But if you distributed that money more evenly across the population, it'd be more likely that each person would be trying to buy a vehicle so that it would be possible for them to drive around and experience the kind of freedom that came with having an automobile. So this maldistribution of wealth, the drag in the farm sector, both of these things are going to lead to this problem of overproduction and underconsumption. Another problem that's looming on the horizon is this relatively unregulated credit market. A lot of the kind of credit that we now have access to today were sort of born in the 1920s, and without some sort of regulatory agency in place that is willing to more appropriately regulate this credit, consumers are free to adopt all sorts of crazy loans that we will see will become a problem once we hit the Great Depression in 1929. Herbert Hoover was the poor unlucky fellow who had the mischance to be elected president in 1928 and thus get blamed for the Great Depression. In some ways, it's kind of unfair for Herbert Hoover. Many of the policies that led to the Great Depression were caused by his predecessor, with whom he disagreed in many respects. Hoover had been Calvin Coolidge's Secretary of Commerce. He was a believer in something called associationalism. He believed that it was ruinous to have all these businesses competing with one another and that the government should play a role in helping them to coordinate their efforts together. Coolidge regarded all of his advice as terrible, but he was in the cabinet in part because he was sort of a national hero by the 1920s. He had been in charge of the Food Administration during the First World War and was seen as a guy who had helped prevent starvation in Europe. But with the coming of the Great Depression, his name will become synonymous with the real depth of the crisis. Now, the event that kind of marks the beginning of the Great Depression is this stock market crash that occurs in October of 1929. And a lot of the brewing factors that were leading to this depression could be seen in this crash. So on the one hand, one of the causes of this stock market crash were some negative reports indicating that consumption was not quite where businesses thought they were going to be. People were just not quite buying as much as factories expected, and so there were some negative reports that came out regarding sales. What made it into a crisis was this relatively unregulated credit market. The belief leading up to October of 1929 was that stock prices would always go up and never go down. It's a common theme in most American bubbles that there is this thing out there, maybe it's land, maybe it's railroad stock, maybe it's stock more generally, but there's something out there that can't lose, and the value of it is supposed to always go up. Well, Americans inevitably discover that that's not true for anything, and in 1929, Americans discovered it was not true for stock market prices. The problem was that because many Americans believed that stock prices would always go up, many of them took out rather crazy loans. At the time, it was called buying stock on the margin, in order to buy stock, and the belief was, well, it didn't really matter, that you could take out a really high interest rate loan to buy extra stock. You'd simply hold on to it for a few months, sell it off, pay off your debts, and make a nice tidy profit for yourself. Well, when these negative reports came out, investors just freaked out. And there was a massive sell-off because investors realized that if they didn't sell their stock right away, they were going to lose everything. Because with the stock prices now going down instead of up, if they didn't sell off right away, there was no way they were ever going to be able to repay these debts they had taken out. The result was that the stock market just crashed, prices went through the floor, and this is the period in which you have stockbrokers jumping from windows on Wall Street committing suicide because they realize that they've been ruined. And this crash is the sort of event that marks the beginning of the Great Depression in American history. And it's hard for Americans to wrap their heads around how deep this financial crisis really was. Americans are losing their homes, banks are closing on a regular basis. At the real depth of the crisis, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. Depending upon where you were in the country, some sections of the country were even more devastated by this financial catastrophe. It's just a real crisis, and even though poor relief had existed in a sort of statewide level for decades at this point, state governments were simply overwhelmed. They were unable to meet the challenges of dealing with this economic catastrophe and helping people who were stuck on the margins. Now, for his part, Hoover is a fairly cautious person. He tended to be sympathetic, and perhaps did things that were well-intentioned, but maybe not as well thought out. One thing that Hoover tried to do, for example, was encourage the Federal Reserve Board to raise interest rates. Now, if you remember back to the Woodrow Wilson administration, you'll remember that the Federal Reserve was there to smooth out the boom and bust cycle of the economy. When the economy wasn't doing well, it was supposed to lower interest rates to encourage people to go out and go shopping again. Well, Hoover reasoned that the problem with the Depression, the reason this crisis happened, was because of easy access to credit. So the way to fix it was to make it hard to access credit so we don't have another bubble like this again. Well, that would make sense during the bubble when the market is going crazy, prices are going through the roof. But when you're actually in the Depression, that's the opposite of what you want to do. And so by putting this pressure on the Fed Reserve, Hoover was encouraging the board to do the exact opposite of what it should have done. Another policy that was well-intentioned was designed to help alleviate the crisis, but perhaps did more harm than good, was Hoover's support for the Hawley-Smoot tariff. Hoover and many others reasoned that if Americans were out of work, Americans then needed to buy American-made products. That if Americans bought American-produced items, that meant more Americans would be working in factories, and that the United States could get out of this crisis sooner. So the Hawley-Smoot tariff was a series of tariffs, protective tariffs, on foreign products designed to increase the price of foreign products so high that Americans would be encouraged to buy locally produced items instead. It passes, it's signed into law. The problem was that any benefits gained by domestic consumption were more than lost by international retribution. So foreign governments really resented this. They didn't like that the United States was passing these high taxes on their products. So those foreign governments retaliated by passing their own protective tariffs on American products. In other words, if you're not going to encourage your citizens to buy our products, well, we're just not going to encourage our citizens to buy your products. So any benefits gained in domestic consumption were more than lost in international drops in consuming American products. Now, Hoover was a little bit more apprehensive about the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. He wasn't really on board with it, but 1932 was an election year. His advisors encouraged him to go along with it. What this was, it was an act of Congress to try and get money into the economy, to provide easy money for businesses to start up new industries, to start up new products. Hoover, being the president, was in charge with distributing this cash, and he proved rather reluctant to spend it. He was concerned about investing in bad businesses, and he wanted to be careful with America's tax money. But of course, that was only part of the reason for this. Certainly, Congress, I'm sure, wanted some great businesses to get started because of this, but what they really wanted was money circulating in the economy so that people could go out and do things like pay their rent and buy bread. And Hoover only ever spent a fraction of the money that Congress had allotted to him. There are lots of pictures like the one you see on the slide in front of you here. They're ironic photos intended to compare and contrast the promise of plenty within the United States and the reality of poverty for many Americans during the Great Depression. So in the background, you have this billboard that's telling Americans, why are you driving yourself? You should sit back, relax, take the train, let someone else do the driving for you. And of course, in the foreground, you have these two hitchhikers who obviously can't afford a train ticket, so they're walking where they need to go. It's not that they don't choose to buy the train ticket, it's just most Americans couldn't afford one anymore because they didn't have a job. Hoover also had a tendency to do things that just made Americans feel like he just didn't understand. So for example, at one point he compared the United States to Germany in the 1930s and said, well, at least nobody's starving like they are over in Central Europe at this point. Well, I suppose that's fine and all, but drawing those comparisons does not really alleviate the problems Americans were facing. It just made it seem as though Hoover didn't really understand the depth of the crisis, that for many Americans who really were having trouble getting food on the table. It just didn't seem like he understood. And then a real political catastrophe for Hoover is this problem of the bonus army. What happened is you had this promise to veterans from World War I that the U.S. would pay them a bonus by 1945. It was a $1,000 check that they would receive in thanks for their service. But of course, that is now many soldiers came from the economic margins. Many of them were hit particularly hard by the Great Depression. And in 1932, a lot of these veterans said, well, that's great that we'll get this check in 1945, but we really need the cash now. And so many of them started marching to Washington, D.C. As the group got closer, the group got bigger as more and more people joined them. And they were basically marching there to ask for an early release of this bonus, that they needed it in 1932. Being impoverished, these veterans of the First World War set up camp outside the Capitol building. They used whatever pieces of scrap material they could find to build temporary housing for themselves, basically cardboard, spare pieces of wood, scrap metal. They threw it together to make some temporary housing. This became a common practice around much of the country, as many people tried to create some kind of dwelling for themselves when they became homeless. The camps that formed across the country became known as Hoovervilles in honor of the president many people blamed for the Depression. So these folks are camped outside of the Capitol building, and in 1932, Hoover gave the order for the U.S. military to go in and chase them out. And so you have photos like this printed across the country of the U.S. military going into the camp, burning the structures down, and rather than meeting with the veterans or meeting them halfway or doing something to alleviate their pain, Hoover just burned them down and chased them away. You can see in this photo that the flames of these ramshackle homes are carrying off into the air. There's a lot of smoke, and in the background you can see the dome of the Capitol. It's not a good sign for American democracy, and it's not a good sign for Hoover's reelection in 1932.